Non, 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 non.
Go, go, go. Les lunettes. Oui, ben non, mettez les lunettes.
So good afternoon. We're going to resume our activities. So we are making progress within session 1 and trying to deepen the concept of sustainability. So we have 3 speakers for the second half of this session. So 2 are with us and one of the speakers is on Zoom. So I'm very pleased to welcome Alexandra Langlais, who is the first speaker with us this afternoon. So Alexandra is a CNRS Research Professor in Environmental Law, also working at the IODE Institute in Rennes, and she focuses an important part of her work on the relationship between environment and agriculture as a legal field of observation. And so, as you can read on the slide, the topic of her presentation is changing our trajectory towards greater sustainability between scientific uncertainties and ecological emergencies. So, Alexandra, you have the floor for 30 minutes.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Before starting, I would like to thank the organizers of this symposium for their invitation to present my thought on the theme of sustainability. So for today, I propose this theme, changing our trajectory towards greater sustainability between scientific uncertainties and ecological emergency. To be honest, I think when I was a little bit ambitious about when I proposed this title. So I would like to develop with you the process that lead me to these reflections on and the states that this implies for the law in general, but also for its construction. First of all, I would like to start with a clear observation. Climate change, erosion of biodiversity, and land degradation are only getting worse. As we are in a train of degradation that continues and even accelerates, it's not difficult to conclude that our current trajectory is undoubtedly moving away from a form of sustainability. So we could conclude, that we need to change. So it's very easy to think that and to conclude that. However, it's important to think about a kind of paradox. Why? Because all environmental policies, whether at international, at European or national level, already aim at sustainable development. It's already the case. In other words, all environmental policies guide and accompany us towards this sustainability. So, and law is one of these instruments to enable us to achieve this objective of sustainable development. So, law constitutes one of the insertion variables to direct our action toward more sustainability. So, how we could resolve this paradox? In order to resolve this paradox, should we simply conclude that the problem is law? And in this case, could we say that law is inadequate to contribute to a sustainable development? Is it possible? Nevertheless, the direction of the objective of that law should purpose, and namely sustainable development, it's not easy to grasp, as we have seen before, and may confuse the message to be followed. According to the definition given to the report in the report of the World Commission on European and Development in the United Nations, known as the Brundtland Report, this expression first appeared in this Brundtland Report. And as you know, I quote, "Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs." In 1992, during the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, the 27 principles of the Rio Declaration on Sustainable Development were proclaimed. The 3 pillars of sustainable development are started for the first time at the international level and constitute the classic representation that we have of sustainable development. And as you know, this classic representation is an entrelace of 3 circle representations of social dimension, the economic dimension and the environmental dimension. And more recently, following the Millennium Development Goal, the Sustainable Development Goal were approved by the United Nations in August 1915. Follow the same idea. It's still based on this conciliation between economy, social, and environment. However, I think that the main problem is that no hierarchy, no priority is envisaged between these 3 pillars. So these requirements of interrelationship between these 3 pillars, which is at the heart of sustainable development, has been widely criticized because it's remained very vague and not very operational when it comes to make concrete choice and trade-off. Or the continuing catastrophic state of the environment are nevertheless led to reflection on the hierarchy of its pillar for the benefits of environment. For example, the main conclusion of the Global Ecosystem Assessment, named the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2015, clearly identify the environment pillar of sustainable development as the condition for meeting these needs. One of the findings of this assessment is that the continued degradation of ecosystem function is, and in this case I quote, a barrier to achieving the Millennium Development Goals. So this approach refers to a different conception or representation of sustainable development that Natalie showed you before. And this latter approach, represented in this diagram, tend to become closer to the original conception of sustainable development as defined in the Brundtland report. As you know, the well-known part of the report, which focuses on the need of present and future generations, we have also a very interesting sentence, and I quote it: in its broadest sense, sustainable development is also defined as harmony among human beings and between harmony and nature. And this part of the presentation, the large definition of sustainable development, is less known. Moreover, even if we remain focused on the needs of present and future generation, their satisfaction depends largely on the contribution provided by ecosystem for food, shelter, clothing, or eating. However, even if we have a hierarchy in favor of the environmental pillar, we have another sources of difficulty that make decision-making and therefore the decision-making choices for achieving sustainable development more complex. Indeed, the choices with regard to the environment and therefore the environment pillar of sustainable development are marked by ecological urgency, but also by strong scientific uncertainties. About, at first, ecological emergency. Ecological emergency because of the state of, as you know, of environmental, climatic and biodiversity degradation, but also the cascading effect to be feared, call us for an immediate action. However, this immediate action to be taken actually in reality depends on the condition in which the emergency occurs. If it's a response to a serious and imminent threat, law is not helpless. As we have seen, for example, in the response of law, in the health crisis, or in the case of terrorism situation. In this case, the legal response is immediate and strong. But in this case, as you know, the legal response can be only temporary. But the emergency may also arise from a threatening situation that has been identified but not addressed in the appropriate time. In other words, we can say that the situation in this case has escalated such an unsustainable state that it has become urgent. It is therefore more a question of the urgency to act than of the implementation of emergency measures as such. In this case, this measure, implementation of emergency measure, they are already part of the legal arsenal. However, this urgency to act does not call for temporary response. On the contrary, it calls for sustainable response that are likely to overturn the current economic and social model. More broadly, it calls us for a change in the system and therefore for a more global approach. About now, the question of the existence of numerous scientific uncertainties. This is a second difficulty with the hierarchy in favor of the environment pillar. In particular about scientific uncertainties, those relating to the functioning of ecosystems. They does not in any way prevent. It's important to have this observation in mind. Does not in any way prevent us from taking action, especially in the face of ecological emergencies that most certainly involve serious and irreversible damage. Yet, acting even in uncertainty is the logic behind the precautionary principle. This principle was first formulated in a non-scientific sense in 1992 as part of the Principle 15 of the Rio Declaration of Environment and Development. According to this principle, where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. But the precautionary principle has a rather encompassing approach to scientific uncertainties, even though scientific uncertainties can be in reality of several kinds. They may be technical, they may be methodological, and similarly, taking scientific uncertainties into account as the principle of action also tends not to make scientific pluralism visible at first sight. Therefore, considering scientific uncertainties more broadly reveals the complexity of the data to be considered in action in addition to the social data, as well as the instability and it's hard to pronounce, instability, of decisions taken on the basis on the known alone. So the combination of ecological emergency and scientific uncertainties, while they're inviting us to act in a short time frame and in a more holistic manner, highlight the complexity of the transition to action, in which law play, of course, a decisive role. However, this transition to action is a guarantee of greater respect for the sustainable and environmental sustainability, of this basic pillar of sustainable development. Is it in fact one of the pillars of sustainable development for which expectations are high? Is it in this pillar that the natural resources that support economies are drawn upon, and it's also in this pillar that guaranteed access to these same resources allows fundamental rights such as the right to food to be respected. So, as evidence of this evolution, I try to identify, without being exhaustive, several clues of a receptivity to a change of approach in law. The first clue, it's the use of concepts that allow a better understanding of the complexity of socio-ecological phenomena. In order to grasp this complex phenomena, law has for several years been developing concepts designing to capture this complexity. These include concepts that seek to tame what is generally considered elusive for law, such as movement, such as processes, and so concept. And it's interesting to see this different kind of concept, because concepts and the evolution are, could reflect the different perception of society's needs in different places and times, and are therefore indicative of key values in the different society. There are also a kind of frameworks within which environmental protection measures are embedded. To illustrate this idea, I will take two examples. The first one is ecosystem services, and the second one will be ecological transition. About ecosystem services, the notion of ecosystem services, as you know, has exploded among academic, policymakers, managers. It's also recently entered into the legal vocabulary. The idea at the heart of this concept is that ecosystem provides services that contribute to human well-being. Also, although it has older roots, the concept has been widely developed as a result in international ecosystem assessment. This is, as I quote before, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. It was during this assessment that the services provided by ecosystem were categorized on the one hand, and the benefit for human on the others. I will not go into details for today. However, I think it's important to stress that this concept of ecosystem services has been and still is a subject of discussion and contestation. In particular, as you know, the criticism relating to the utilitarian and anthropocentric nature of ecosystem services show the debates surrounding the value attributed to the environment. The possibility of placing a monetary value of these services and thus accounting for their place in this monetary reference system is still the subject of much debate. But, however, this debate obscures other contribution of ecosystem services, in particular the ecological value of these services. Ecosystem services make it possible to focus on the functioning of ecosystems. Without proper functioning, and thus without all the valuable interaction within ecosystems, no services can be provided. Therefore, more than the ecosystem services itself and the controversies surrounding it, it's the ecosystem approach that I think is important to emphasize. The ecosystem approach that advocates in the Convention of Biological Diversity in 1992 offer good prospects that have not yet been fully explored. In particular, I think it makes it possible to transcend spaces limited by the state or other administrative entities, and therefore it's important because they could consider space through the prism of the ecological relevance. And about the other example, my second example, I think I'm too late. No, it's okay. My second example, it's about ecological transition, which I think it's important because it refers to a different relationship to time than sustainable development. Like sustainable development, ecological transition is enhanced as an objective, but as an intermediate objective, and therefore a transition from one state to another. Is it therefore understood as a concept open to an accelerated change of behavior or an accelerated transformation, at least before the damage cause is irreversible? Moreover, while both objectives should lead to a certain balance between the essential pillars of sustainable development, the approach of these two concepts, ecological transition and sustainable development, is different. These two approaches are different. If we look at the first principle of the 1992 Rio Declaration, human beings are at the center of concern for sustainable development. They have, I quote, the right to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature. In the same approach, the second principle of the same declaration states that the right to development should be realized in a manner which equitably meets the developmental and environmental needs of present and future generations. In the context of ecological transition, I think we are not dealing with a right to development, but rather with a logic of humans who would be actors of or drivers to change. However, if the emergence of a concept or actor in the imitation of the law, they still need to be legally implemented. Is it not, therefore, a question of introducing concept into the legal corpus to compensate for the inability, for example, of the law to grasp or a changing or uncertain reality? Beyond the essential question of the implementation of this concept and this value they carry, they are interesting because of the approach they invite to take, which can in itself constitute a form of legal implementation. So just about this mention of the approach, I will go to the second clue. About the second clue, it concerns attempts to move away from a fragmented approach to law, or to move away from an approach in silo, which is not compatible with an understanding of the complexity of situations. In addition to the ecosystem approach that we have briefly discussed, several changes in the preparatory work for the decision can be also identified. These changes are also conducive to a more holistic approach to environmental decision making and action. I have also two examples to explain my purpose. The first example concerns the 2030 agenda, which set out the Sustainable Development Goals. This agenda is based on, as I explained before, is based on the requirement for interrelationship between the three pillars of sustainable development, as set out in goals and targets, which are, and it's the most interesting part, which are considered as, I quote, integrated and indivisible. By this expression, the agenda indicates that environmental, economic and social issues are not parallel but form a whole. And this is a very big difference with this agenda and the previous one. A second example about this non-fragmented approach is a recent joint approach between the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBS. For the first time, they decided to have joint seminar in June 2021. And in this first seminar, the two international bodies are really taking the time to cross-reference the issue of climate change and biodiversity. And this reveals a clear need for synergy of action between the conservation of biodiversity and the fight against climate change. In this respect, the introductory remarks of this report are enlightening. And I quote, "Climate change and biodiversity loss are two of the most pressing issues of the Anthropocene. While there is recognition in both scientific and policymaking circles that the two are interconnected, in practice they are largely addressed in their own domains. Each issue as in a whole international convention, and each as an intergovernmental body which assesses available knowledge. Among the synergy, what this seminar focus on are nature-based solutions. And it is regarded interesting to mention that about that, they think that restoration is among the cheapest and rapidly implemented nature-based climate mitigation measures. And it's interesting to note that this seminar, just this year, they decided to have a common seminar about the same problem, same global problem. But however, there is a problem, because these first two clues are indicative of a change in the approach of law and a desire to better embrace shifting and interdependent issues. The fact remains that law must act urgently in certain world. In this case, the use of scientific prediction can be a useful tool, perhaps, to ensure that law is implemented. This led us for our three clues. The acceptance of scientific prediction places law, I think, in a new relationship between law and science, because it's no longer a question of law seeking to get closer to ecological reality in order to better define it by introducing scientific concepts. It's now a matter of projecting the future of the planet with science by anticipating or confirming hypotheses. But before going further, I think it's important to clarify what it means by scientific predictions. Several authors distinguish between prediction as a tool for validating scientific hypotheses and prediction for anticipation of possible futures. The role of the first prediction, the role of the first one, is then to be confronted with the observation of the system and the study in order to corroborate or invalidate the hypotheses from which they are deduced. They are prediction of confirmation of precise hypotheses. But even if we could confirm some hypotheses, it's hard to know the trajectory of an ecosystem in this case, if you are in the observation. Prediction can also be a description of a possible future, prediction the future of a given system according to certain hypotheses, for example, by projecting past trends or by considering the possible consequences of different alternative options. And like the former, they are not confirmed by fact, by observation. On the contrary, some predictions, such as the IPCC worst-case scenarios, are produced precisely in order to be avoided. So we couldn't, in this case, use the observation to validate the different hypotheses. So scientific prediction, we could have different kind of scientific prediction. They have not the same purpose, but at each time there is a part of scientific uncertainties. It's just hard to say what trajectory an ecosystem will take. And a lot of authors would like to have the best organization about or the best use of scientific prediction, and they would like to have a hierarchy. The first one, it's to provide reliable knowledge, and after that, on the basis of this knowledge, we could anticipate the future. I will finish in the couple of minutes. A second, sorry. So just to finish. So, but in this case, knowledge in ecology is still partial and uncertain, and the environmental emergency does not allow us to wait for it to stabilize before guiding actions. So therefore, in all case, the whole case law must navigate with a rather impressive compass in order to take short and long-term decisions, especially as there is rarely a single possible option. So I will not have time to give you the different kind of possible action follow. Just to give you the question of greater flexibility. This is one of the solutions. It's greater possibility. It's just to decide to develop a more adaptation of law. Another possible situation is to consider worst case scenario. So if you consider worst case scenario, we have two options also. Law could consider in this case that we could go in the same direction as we know, for example, that we have known in the health situation. So in this case, with some strong measures, with some possibility with some strong measure. I will, because if I give you a lot of explanation, I not have a lot of time. And we could also decide to accompany, for example, the different kind of technology for climate change, and we could pray to have some modification of our trajectory. And the last situation is to accept these scientific uncertainties. And in this case, how could we be in the situation where uncertainties are there to accept them? Could we have the possibility to discuss collectively or not? And this is the last point. So I'm sorry, it's very quick at the end. Thank you for listening. And just the last, I translate in English. The last 4 slides. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. You have raised many difficulties as well as potential solutions. So I'm sure that there will be questions or comments from the audience. So I open the door to the audience. Would you have any questions or comments?
It's hard at this time of
Probably, but we have the coffee break. Ben, please.
Oh, it says I can speak. Oh, very good. Thank you. That was so interesting. And there was a point you were talking about capturing complexity of socio-ecological phenomena as reflecting values from the society. So I didn't quite understand what was preferable in terms of where the law...
Sorry?
What would the law prefer in terms of... You were saying that there were values embedded in these understandings of socio-ecological phenomena. So in terms of the law, what does the law require? What works?
So thank you very much for your interesting question, because I think there is a fight in law. There are a lot of difficulty for law to decide which value we could follow or not. And for the moment, we have a kind of hierarchy between the different kind of values that we could follow. And especially as Natalie explained before, the use of the words. When we use natural capital, of course, the value that you would like to follow, it's from economic value. If you try to follow, we would like to follow ecosystem services, the values that you would like to follow, it's more economic value. But if you're at each time, this is why I explained that there is a fight inside law, because at each time you have another word, and one of the words that have a lot of importance now. It's interesting because it's nature, and it was not a word that this is a word that belonged to the past. And now we are very interesting with this word. The example, it's at the international level, the idea of harmony with nature, for example. So at each time we have a kind of fight, and I think the value, it also depends on the culture, but it also depends on the time. For example, this idea of economic value, it was not the case in the past decades, and now I think yes, we have a lot of fight, because it's to say that we could protect environment without thinking in economic value, because this is our reference. But in my case, I think it's a little bit dangerous to think like that, because we have not the same value in over the world, and especially when I am. This is about my experience. I was one of the author of the IPBES report, and it was very interesting to see that the term of ecosystem services was not accepted, especially by the autochthone people. They considered that we could have, we are a part of the nature, so we couldn't accept the term of services. It's not possible to accept that. So it's it was very interesting to see the evolution. The transformation to ecosystem services, to contribution to people's nature, contributions to people. So there is I think that it's very important to have the impact of the world.
Thank you. I see Rémi Barbier has a question, please.
Yeah, yes, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Could you please give us some empirical examples of this better reception of scientific predictions in law? Just to be sure that I really understood this. I think it's a key notion, a key concept. But could you give us some examples?
Yeah, this is thank you very much, Rémi, for your question, and it's interesting because this is an exterior tool of law, and but it could guide law for the decision, and policymakers are very interesting in this kind of tools. So I think it's a previous step. You have the first step, it's to the scientific step. The second step is to make some scenario for decision making, and the policymaker decided or not to follow. And after that, law will transform. We will have some legal measures, and it's. For me, this is the most problem, because we have the decision to follow or not this approach, this scientific approach or not, and to take into account of the scientific controversies. I think it's the first step, and the second is to have in mind that there is no guarantees of this result. So this is just an information. And I could give you an example. It's about some project of restoration of ecosystems. And now we have very important injunction, to develop restoration and to develop more and more. And we will have the case with the European with the European level. And in this case, it's how could we decide, for example, to develop restoration just in front of the sea, with the situation of the level of sea, and we have some information, but just some information, and after that we could follow or not. And I would like just to add something about that. It's I think we have at a step where the policymaker have to decide without staying behind the scientific, because we have a very big question of legitimacy in this case, because they have not the legitimacy in reality to think about the future, because they have no idea. And the main problem is that now we have to decide on the evidence-based policies, but the percentage of decision of the evidence-based policy, it's around, I give you a number, but it's around 10%. So we decide on 10% that we know. And so in this, this is why one of the options of solution that I propose, it's I think that now we have to accept this uncertainties, this uncertainties in general. I'm sorry about my English.
Yes, I'm sorry too. Do you think it makes a huge difference when we are considering environmental scientific uncertainties and, for example, medical scientific uncertainties? Because we can, I think there is a long tradition for judges, for example, to decide whether or not to free a prisoner based on a medical diagnosis. And so it's also a way to decide based on a scientific uncertainty. And so maybe it could be interesting to see what is the same and what is not the same when we are dealing with environmental scientific uncertainties.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we could make some parallel with medical approach, and but with we have not the same purpose, because when we see the hierarchy in legal interest, the top of the legal interest, it's human. At each time it's human health. So we have not the same. For the moment, we have not the same approach, but to make parallel, I think it's very important. And there are some paper about this parallel between environmental aspects and medical aspects.
Thank you. I'm sorry, but I won't take any more questions because we have 2 more speakers. But at the end, if we have more time, I will give you the floor. So, thank you very much. We now move to the second key speaker, Eric Pino, who is with us on Zoom. We also have other speakers who will speak tomorrow. Eric Pino, good afternoon. Can you hear us?
Very well. I think you can hear me.
Thank you. Yes, perfectly. I think you're going to
Great.
wake up the audience. But that's perfectly fine.
Bring it down a bit, right?
So, Eric Pino, you are professor at the Institute of Environmental Sciences and at the Department of Sociology at Quebec University in Montreal, and the president of the scientific committee of the IODE, and you are also an USIAS fellow, fellow for the Institute of Advanced Studies at the University of Strasbourg. So we are very pleased to have you with us today, and you are going to cover the topic, the sustainability, planetary boundaries, to what and for whom, growth, capitalism and environmental limits today. So I think that, just to make a quick short transition with the previous speaker, that you're going to deepen this concept of trajectories. So Eric, you have the floor for 30 minutes.
Great. I just started my timers. Thank you for having accepted that I participate virtually. Because of the COVID situation, I'm not able to leave the North American continent professionally. I could leave on vacation, but professionally, my university will not allow me to move for the moment. So I'm happy to be able to participate, and I'm sorry if this is a virtual session. I'm going to use slides for my presentation, and I will not say everything that's on the slides, but the slides will be there in case that the voice doesn't come across well, or that there's a lot of lagging. And I'll try my best to keep this lively. So here goes the partage d'écran. So hopefully, okay, I see that it works. Great, okay. As I prepared this presentation, I kept on having the feeling that I was kind of studying a dead star. You know, a dead star, you can still see it in the sky, the light comes. But, and you're studying the light that's coming, but it's just not there anymore. And that's kind of how I felt with plunging into this literature around sustainable development and going back to the 90s and going back. And what I will do is present what I think is emerging after sustainable development as an operative concept inside the environmental sciences, and also, I would say, more to the point, inside the movements that are pushing for transition. So I'm going to shift away from a lot of the presentations that I've heard up to now were focused on a lot of them at the state level, a lot of them, except for the first one, around legal issues. You're going to plunge with me into political economy, into economics a bit, and move away a bit from the legal system and more into the economic system. And I hope this is not too violent a shift. And just maybe to put some, let's say, some background to all this, as we head towards the COP in Glasgow, and where countries are supposed to take more ambitious targets and put into place more ambitious pledges. We are going through a consumption bounce back, which is a global consumption bounce back, post-COVID bounce back, which is creating supply bottlenecks all over the world, which is creating an energy demand spike, which is creating a lot of tension on energy markets. Because we had slowed investment in fossil fuel extraction, and because renewable energy investments were not up to the par in the past 5 or 6 years. So, and we still today, we know that we have to burn fossil fuels to create renewable energy systems. We can't make renewable energy systems with renewable energy, unfortunately. We still need gas, coal, and oil to build wind turbines, wind pals, and to build solar panels. So this really paradoxical context is the political economy conjuncture that is going to I think, informed the Glasgow meeting. And I'm going to try, I'm not going to directly address this conjuncture, but I'm going to try by stepping back a bit to look at, how this plays out in terms of sustainability issues. All right, so, there's the summary. So I want to start with and it's the drawing that you can see as the background. I want to comment that right away, and then go what I call the progressive imaginary of growth, and then go into the significance of the shift from sustainable development to this discourse around limits, because we were in limits in the 70s. We shifted from this idea of limits to development in the 80s and 90s, and we are shifting back again into a conception of environmental problems around limits with this new planetary boundaries approach. And I want to dig into this approach and see what it implies in terms of paradigm shift in the environmental sciences, but also in terms of how we understand transition. And I want to give a specific angle, take a specific, examine in a specific way this question of limits as limits to growth. And I think that to speak about limits to growth, we have to take into account what type of growth we're dealing with, and the growth that I want to study is capitalist growth, and I want to share with you a few insights on what this means and what that can then mean for sustainability studies. So this is kind of we've all seen this graph tons of times. I just basically abstracted out of the millions of graphs that are out there that show us trajectories of transition. I basically fuse them together into this very simplistic rendition, where I put on one axis what I call the degree of material emancipation, which you can measure in gigajoules per capita or domestic material consumption per capita, or you could take another, biophysical indicator of how human societies are able to abstract themselves from subsistence constraints, let's say, put it that way. And then on the other axis, I put this very general idea of social emancipation, progress, if you want, on a social side. So that could be the right to vote, women's rights to have property and to exist as civic beings, racial justice, legal. That could be one way of understanding it. We could also just do it on IDH, an index of human development, and that would give us the same thing. And what I'm trying to say is that these two axes are a way they frame what I call the progressive imaginary that is at the heart of the whole sustainability discourse. And the problem that we have is that we are in this era of sociological transition, and we're faced with alternatives. And there are three basic alternatives that I think are out there. There's the trajectory of the progressive trajectory. We can break through the barrier. We can decouple. We can become a solar society. That was the 70s. The 70s was this idea of solar society. Today we speak about breakthrough or decoupling. And there are others that say, no, we can't. But we can continue, though, progressing socially while we downshift materially. And we do this through degrowth or through sufficiency, which are the two main ways of seeing this. And then finally, there are those that say that, we won't be able to manage the transition. We will just fall into collapse for various reasons, political, psychological, cultural. Transition is not a trajectory we can plan. Transition is something that will be imposed on us by the changes in the biosphere and the geosphere, and thus we are faced with a trajectory of collapse. And then this collapse can be regressive, so those are the arrows that are going back in terms of social emancipation, or we can maintain our current social progress somehow while really seeing our material conditions degrade rapidly. So I think this is the framework in which sustainability is to be discussed, and I'm going to discuss mostly options orange and green, and not really discuss option yellow. And I think it's the biggest difference is limits. If limits exist, then the green option is probably the only option that's available for us. Whereas if limits if limits are something we can transgress because we believe in technical progress, then we should be working towards orange. And I would say that sustainable development is more, and green growth is the orange trajectory, whereas the limits is the green. I just wanted to set this up as a framework. So let's step back and, you know, how have things evolved in terms of paradigms in the environmental sciences and in environmental movements? Well, I would say that we've shifted from the sustainable development three-tiered or three-pillared approach into the planetary boundaries approach. And just one small example of this, when Greta Thunberg goes to Davos, what does she say? She doesn't say, we must harmonize society, environment, and the economy. No, she says to the crowd out there, we must learn to live inside planetary boundaries. That's the expression she uses. And for me, that's an indicator of a paradigm shift. And what does this paradigm shift say? And I don't want to get into all the implications, but it says basically that we are not in this idea of three independent and interdependent spheres that have spaces of intersection. We are in a bounded world. It is bounded by natural processes. And I think that's the biggest shift that we've seen, this idea of the bounded. And even the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, they've shifted the representation from the three pillars to this idea of boundedness, where the economy is stuck in these wider circles of society and nature. And in the social sciences, this has been taken up, you know, by Kate Raworth and her Donut Economics, and where she added, there's this outer layer of natural boundaries and this inner layer of what she calls the social foundation. And I think it's a new way, a new mode of representing the sustainability issues. So what does the planetary boundaries do? Well, it sets up this idea of limits, and it's I think there's three interesting things in this. First of all, a new representation of the planet as an Earth system. And this is really a paradigm shift inside the earth sciences, which I think is important. I don't want to go too much into this, but it's the idea that the earth forms an ecological totality, that there are this integration through biogeochemical cycles, and that there's critical processes that we have to look into. A new way of understanding history, which is important, which is non-linear, with irreversible, cumulative, iterative, and with this idea of tipping points. And finally, in theory, planetary boundaries should be interdisciplinary, which means we have coupled orders of causality. Economic processes become ecological processes and vice versa. And in theory, we should have interdisciplinary dialogue. In practice, in my field, teaching environmental sciences in North America, what we see is a lot of biologists, geologists, and earth scientists in general improvising themselves as social scientists, sociologists, economists, and it's sometimes interesting and sometimes problematic. What are the limits of this approach? Well, the limits, and you know, we've been discussing this for the past 10 years, so I won't get into much detail. But you know, why 9 boundaries? Why not 5? Why not 4? Why not 10? Why not 12? The limits are fuzzy, and the graph shows this. This is from the Rockström paper. Who determines the safe space for humanity and how? Inside the whole planetary boundaries, there's a technocratic bias. It's been called a geoengineer's gaze on the Earth. This way of understanding sustainability. Something that has not been discussed that much, but I think is very important and should be much more discussed, is the fact that in the whole planetary boundaries literature, the Holocene as a period has been elected and given normative status. You know, why should we want to stay in that? Why should we make staying in the Holocene something that's an absolute? Nature doesn't have to stay in the Holocene; could shift towards something else. Anyway, and finally, and most importantly, and this is what I'll be discussing today, the weakness of engagement with the social sciences in this whole approach. But still, what does it give us? Well, it gives us, if we take the graph that I had that I had at the very beginning, well, it gives us a new representation of sustainability, which is based on a ceiling and a floor. We have a ceiling with planetary boundaries, and we have a floor, which we can consider a socio-metabolic minimum, the minimum amount of energy we need to have an organized society or the minimum amount of material flows that we need to sustain a complex industrial society such as ours. And then we have two solutions to this. We can either break through the boundary, but risk overshoot, which would mean geoengineering, which would mean believing in nuclear fusion, maybe as a form of energy that can bring us beyond the boundaries. Or we can engage, and it's a very big political risk, but engage into what one could call a planned descent, which is a big political risk, because what if halfway engaged into the planned descent, we end up discovering this technology that is a breakthrough that could bring us beyond the planetary boundaries that we had decided that were then the ones that were important, and that had normative status. So that's the and then the third option is just that we won't be able to, and this is probably the most probable outcome, unfortunately, that we won't be able to choose between overshoot and planned descent, and we'll kind of stay stuck in a middle position, and collapse is probably what we might have to go through. So we being 28 authors attacked this problem in a paper that was published this spring, on which a lot of what I have to say is based. And I can just stop talking at this point. I have 13 minutes left. I'll use them up, but still, I can just stop talking and you can read the paper. But that means that if I don't have enough time, then you can just grab the paper and read it, and it's all in there, everything else that follows. But this was an interesting engagement. Me and the four first authors, so Uli, Barbara, and Marlene, worked for 2 years getting together 28 people to get a consensus on these issues. And the questions that we ask in the paper are limits to what, limits to whom, and basically how can social sciences answer to the big question that the natural scientists ask us. They're asking the question, what is driving unsustainability? And their answer is technological lock-in and socioeconomic inertia. But these are black boxes. So our idea is, how can we open up these black boxes and explain them with concepts from our disciplines? And the road we took, the trajectory, to speak in these terms, that we took as political economists mostly, was to use the concept of capitalism, which as a heuristic, which we found interesting to do this. So, oops, sorry, I'm not there. Okay, oops, that went too fast. All right, well, limits to what? Well, why limits? That's the first question we could ask. Why just not, why not green growth, which is, no limits, and let's, well, what's the advantage of green growth? The advantage is, well, it's a weak shakeup of the status quo, and that can be useful. Why? Well, it mobilizes business as usual institutions and social relations. People can continue driving. They just drive electric cars. So that's maybe one advantage. A second advantage is social stability. You're not telling people that their mode of living is fundamentally flawed, and that they must totally change the way they see their trajectory and the trajectory of their children. No, the way you live, and so basically it's socially maybe more stable. And finally, you can act immediately. You don't have to change society to act. You just act. And what does this mean in capitalism? Well, it means that the way out is through innovation, and innovation rests on investment. And to have investment, you need growth. All these are tied macroeconomically. To have a high investment rate, you need a high growth rate, and the high investment rate tends to foster innovation, technological innovation. So what do you do then? What's your policy? Your policy is eco-efficiency needs strong growth, and you have to correct this strong growth through price signals, because price signals are the least intrusive mechanism that we can find inside a growth machine, such as a capitalist economy. So you set up price signals for investors, consumers, and producers to direct innovation in a certain direction. And you hope to have decoupling. That's what your idea. And you do see signs of relative decoupling, and you hope that this leads to absolute decoupling. And then you say, and there's a co-benefit to all this stuff, is that we can alleviate poverty, which is pretty interesting as an outcome. And thus your idea is, let's not limit growth, but let's limit bad growth. Up here, you can probably see my mouse. You have a typical representation of decoupling, and I don't want to explain it. I think it's things that we know. But and down here you have the sad reality of of the last 47 years, which is not decoupling, but which is accelerated material flows or accelerated extraction. And this is data taken from various from the Herberl, the Vienna people, and this is stuff that I just compiled myself from our world in data on energy flows. And as you can see in all these graphs, I could comment on graph after graph, but there is no decoupling, forget it. We are in an accelerating trajectory right now, globally. Okay, but then you can say, yeah, but some people are decoupling and others, so maybe they're the ones to follow. And if you see here, you look at the US, you look at Europe, you can see that, well, their growth doesn't seem to foster more or higher extraction of materials. Even actually, they had a crisis which brought it down. The only thing that's rising is Asia and maybe Latin America. Their material consumption is rising. So maybe once they achieve this level, it'll stabilize and we'll get some form of decoupling. Well, this is looking at material consumption by region. When you look at material footprints, which is taking into account stuff extracted here that is consumed here, well, you get a different picture. You have a picture where actually, yes, the Chinese material consumption is going up, but it's basically stabilizing and being absorbed up here. So basically, what I want to get to is that you have a international division of labor and unequal ecological exchange, where decoupling here is based on telecoupling there. And this leads to a more profound observation, is that to understand the social economic inertia and to understand growth drivers, we have to look at inequality not as an effect of growth, but as a cause of unsustainability. So stop looking at inequalities as symptoms, as effects, and look at inequalities as drivers. Some people have more power over the economy than others, and these peoples, in the plural, have lock-in effects, unsustainable lock-in effects, either as mass consumers, which are necessary to keep up effective demand, that's what we are, or when we're talking about the top 1 or 0.1% as elite positional consumers, whose income effects also are growth drivers. So basically, if we're talking about limits, we have to think about limits with some form of class analysis. Limits must not be addressed to humanity. They must be addressed to those that have some form of class power. And this class power is not only intra-national, inside nations, but it's international. The Western middle class is as much part of the problem as is our elites. The second thing that we have to look at, and I don't want to go through all this, it's in the paper and these ways of looking, but is to understand how economic growth is locked into the institutional structures of the economy, and that economic growth has a necessary material counterpart. That growth is material, and thus that for a bunch of reasons that I don't want to get into because I only have 5 minutes left, you have relations between innovation, investment, and growth, and the material dimension of the economy that lock in unsustainability and that prevent a trajectory of transition based on furthered accumulation. I guess that's how I would say it, and I'll move now because I've got 4 minutes left to the almost the takeaway. Back in the 70s, the people that were discussing limits before we discovered sustainable development and the idea of this triple win approach where business, environmental groups, and trade unions could get together and say we can find some form of new compromise. Before that, in the 70s, when we were in more oppositional approaches to environmental problems, Schneeberg developed this expression which he called the unpolitics of expansion. In a capitalist society, everything is politicized except for expansion, except for growth, and I think that is maybe the biggest limit to trying to have institutionalized limits inside a capitalist society, is that the society is based on the unpolitics of expansion. I'm looking at, and there's 4 dimensions to this. The first one is, and I could get into the details maybe in the discussion, but the economic process is defined by accumulation, and this accumulation, metabolic analysis has shown it in the past 10 years, is material. It cannot dematerialize. It always has a material foundation. That's I guess the first important. The second one is that a capitalist society is based on the growth of wage-dependent classes. Wage-dependent classes provision themselves through commodities, and this creates an expansionary demand regime for more goods and more services to be produced. And this is a worldwide phenomenon. We're seeing middle classes, consumption-based middle classes arising in Asia. So this is also a growth driver and a material growth driver. And it's got 2 tiers. It's got a subjective tier. People anticipate progressive growth. And it's got an objective tier. Businesses invest through advertisement, for design, in consumption norms, which reinforce the subjective anticipation of progressive growth. The state also fosters economic expansion because, well, it supports its capacity to intervene in the economy, and the effect of state intervention in the economy is growth, but also because growth sustains and fosters social stability, mitigates social conflict, keeps us away from class struggle. The more the pie grows, the less we struggle over shares of the pie. And then finally, and that's, I think, the most important thing, is that we are still locked into an ideological and cultural vision of a progressive growth society. And this progressive growth society frames answers to sociological contradictions as growth problems. And for me, that's what sustainable development is all about. That's why we have 3 pillars. That's why we need this 3rd economic pillar, to be independent of the environment and independent of the social sphere, and to have its own recognized objective logic. And this logic is not a logic of the economy, but it is, if you study the literature, a logic of business. And I think it's very important to distinguish economics and business. It's a business logic. And then finally, this then supports the formation of what we could call growth coalitions as governing regimes, which are the actual policy frameworks in which sustainability issues have been regulated in the past 30 or 40 years, and I think that explains a bit the as we say in French, the surplace that we are making in climate and in environmental policy in the past 30 years. So one last slide. I've got 21 seconds left. Oops, that was too fast. I won't read this, but this is the conclusion of the paper. I just want to read maybe the last sentence, which I think is important. An initial task of such a framework would be to commonly develop a better understanding of the interrelations and interactions of biophysical and societal structures and processes. To overcome the disciplinary constraints with the sustainability research community, and therefore to challenge the downplaying or incomprehension of dangers associated with pandering to or naively trusting current decision makers and power holders. I think that's what we're trying to say there is move science away from the growth coalition, and that could breaking away from this dead star that is maybe sustainable development. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for the positive note at the end of the conclusion, but there is still a lot of work to do for researchers, and in particular with this interdisciplinary perspective, this is exactly what we need to do. I will give the floor to the audience. Would you have any questions or comments? Yes, we have one question from Frederick Zunberg.
Maybe, if it's not dangerous. No, I found it highly fascinating. A few things. We are present at a certain time of human history where there are huge amounts of populations aspiring to a certain wealth. They want cars, they want fridges, they want all sorts of things. But in due time, they will have them. Question is, will population grow so that there will be an eternal increase of people of this kind? I think one of my compatriots, Rusling, thinks that it will not, because women don't want more than 2 children, whatever, and that will settle the matter. They may be Jews, they may be all sorts of things. But that's, I think, to understand the excavation problem, and whether it is a durable problem or whether it's a temporary problem at this juncture of human history, and it may be gone in 50 years or sometime 100 or whatever, and we may adapt our plans to that. I say this because recycling is a real big business which is coming on, and most things you buy today claim that we are 100% recycled, we are 80%, 70%, but I think there's a big ambition to recycle, and in more developed societies there's a huge recycling and not so much additional excavation as your graphs also illustrate. And that is probably a state which most countries will reach at a certain level of, well, within a certain period of time. Very difficult to say which, but it's something which could, so to say, help us decide what kind of policies, short-term, middle-term, and so forth. The other thing goes with international politics. It's nice to say that you can downscale and so forth, but in the world we still live in kind of a Westphalian world, as the politicians or the political scientists say. That is, it's countries who have not too important common values. They confront each other. Their survival depends on them being strong, being able to innovate in all areas, and having strong industries. And that's the way they keep the enemies from invading them and from taking over. Some parts of the world has managed better, like Europe, with the Council of Europe, with the European Union, and so forth. But many parts of the world are certainly not in that area, and military might is extremely important. And very difficult to conceive that countries under that kind of pressure would downscale anything but possibly the quality of life of ordinary citizens. They would never downscale industry or excavation or anything like that, which is important in order to have the tools necessary to survive. Those are my 2 comments, and possibly you have some counter comments or some additional comments. Thank you.
Sure. Elisabeth, do you want me to answer right away?
Yes, please. And I think you can also read in the chat the question or comment from Klaus Kummerer.
Yeah, I took it more as a comment than a question, but maybe I can speak to that. But just on what's been said, well, there I would say 3 things that I would answer to that. I agree that the demographic cycle is complex. It's non-linear. I don't see and you know, I'm not a demograph. I've got a colleague that is demograph, and I usually ask him when I have these problems, when these questions. But I see evidence of a stabilization of the global demographic regime in the coming 50 years. So that would be the first thing. But then the other thing is that when you weight people by material consumption or by joule, by energy consumption, well, you know, this demographic argument tends to fall apart because a minority of us are over consuming, whereas a majority, you know, in Quebec, we are at 190 gigajoules per capita per year. The world average is around 50. So we count for 3 people on this planet, right? So demographics doesn't explain everything. And that leads me to the second idea. And I didn't have time to develop it in the presentation, and I won't have time to develop it here in length. But I think from an economic point of view, you have to distinguish between economies that are surplus producing economies, and I'm not talking about global trade, I'm talking in a biophysical sense, and economies that are surplus absorbing, and whose problem is to absorb the massive surplus that exists in worldwide. And these economies are our economies. And I think that's what unequal ecological exchange permits us to do, or telecoupling, if you'd rather, expression, which is more neutral, less politicized. Telecoupling explains to us these very different functions between the core and the periphery. And I think that's the challenge that we're faced, is that the material consumption of some is based on its capacity to absorb, not its capacity to efficiently use. And it's very different, which brings me to recycling. And then I'll have a general comment on growth. You know, there's been a lot of progress in the past 10 years in environmental accounts. And, you know, we have economy-wide environmental accounts for most developed nations that go back for a century. And for most regions of the world, we can go back at least until the 1970s. So these are robust, well-built accounts. You can have them at UNEP, you can have them elsewhere. And we can measure the amount of recycling that we have globally and for certain regions. And unfortunately, the numbers are very disappointing. You know, for 5 tons extracted, not tons. Yeah, every 5 tons extracted, we can recycle less than 1 globally. And this is in 2016. And in the EU, where in theory we should be very efficient, it's even lower because of the type of consumption that we have, which is not mass based. So recycling is useful for certain critical substances. It can be used, copper, aluminum, but it's not. I mean, there are very hard material facts around recycling, and you know, you can't recycle cement, you can't recycle fossil fuels, you can't recycle fuels, solar powered, solar panels. You can't recycle wind turbines, and you can't recycle the wind pals of. So yeah, I love recycling to be a solution, and I think it will be part of a solution in a future economy that designs in the recyclability of its materials, but we're not there yet. Very far from it. And maybe one last comment on a more general comment around history. The growth pattern that's called the Great Acceleration is a historical anomaly. If you look at organized human societies since the Neolithic, there's nothing really quite like it. Fossil fuels subsidized a planetary experiment. And a few people benefited from this experiment, and most of the planet didn't benefit and are unfortunately going to live the consequences. That's the way I tend to see it. I tend to have this view of it. Instead of seeing growth as normal, I see it as abnormal. it might have been a good thing or bad thing. That's a normative question. I don't want to discuss here. We could discuss in other forums. I think as a scientist, what I'm more interested in is understanding what it was. And it was an anomaly. It was based on tapping into geological reserves, which are, for various reasons, going to be harder and harder to tap into in the coming century. And I think that that's the way we have to turn the sustainability question around and say, you know, how can we sustainably work our way out of this anomaly without collapsing? I think that's the question that we're faced with. It's a very dire question, but I think it's the question that really makes sense.
Thank you. We will take one more question. Just if you can say who you are.
Thank you. I will.
Yes.
Johan Negruccio, École Normale Supérieure de Lyon. I'll be very, very brief. Could you be more specific on what do you call bad growth? And if you go into it, could you make sure that you bring me light on how far we can go if we decide to do or to undo social and ecological dumping?
Did I just want to, and maybe somebody can put it in the chat so I'm sure I heard right, the social and ecological dumping?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Yeah, what we call externalization. Yeah, great. Yeah. Well, bad growth and good growth is not are not, well, they're not categories I use. I don't qualify, or I would in another, if I would use the expression bad growth, it would be more from a macroeconomic point of view. It wouldn't be from an ecological point of view. I think the good growth, bad growth distinction is a distinction inside the paradigm that sees growth as part of the solution. I don't. But then one could say, well, traditionally one could say that bad growth was not going towards relative decoupling, but well, you could say Canada is an example of bad growth, where we think that by developing our fossil fuel extractive sector, we can do an ecological transition. But I'd rather go to your dumping question, which for me is really central. In the field of social metabolism and in the field of political ecology, and also now in ecological economics, we've started to attack one central tenet of development theory, which is the idea that productivity is an unproblematic concept, and that productivity gains are result from innovation, from knowledge, and are thus kind of socially neutral. And we've done that by by breaking open this idea of productivity and saying, okay, could productivity gains be subsidized by externalization elsewhere of the costs of the productivity? So let's say, electric vehicle revolution, one could argue, is being subsidized by the extractive exploitation conditions in the lithium triangle between Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia. And the conditions there are, or to take another example, Quebec's clean aluminum, because our aluminum is transformed with clean hydroelectricity, is possible only because the conditions in which bauxite is extracted in Guinea are horrible. So to try to link together, to not see the dumping as accidental, but to see it as an inherent dimension of the low costs and of the efficiency of the productivity. So that is something that is being explored more and more now by many ecological economists, opening up this box. And that puts into question this whole idea of decoupling then, because the gains that we would make would always be at the expense of something. Some ecological economists have gone to the point of saying that, well, then growth is just a zero-sum game. I wouldn't go that far. But I would still say that we have to have a suspicious relationship to any productivity gain and try to find the socio-ecological costs that are hidden, that are externalized by this productivity gain.
Thank
And
you.
then,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, we need to stop there because we have a third speaker and I would like to give her enough time for a presentation. Thank you, that was very rich, and I know there were more questions within the audience, and I'm sorry for those who couldn't raise. But maybe we will have more time in other sessions to come back to those issues. So now I would like to introduce Farah Jerrari. Farah Jerrari is a PhD candidate from the University of Grenoble Alpes, working on the topic of sustainable energy in international law, and her research covers various topics such as energy, sustainability, and climate change. And you graduated in international and European law, but also in management, which is very interesting. So, Farah, I give you the floor for 20 minutes. Thank you.
Perfect. I would like to first thank all the organizers for today. I'm extremely happy and honored to be here to speak about such an important and interesting topic. And my presentation will build on a lot that have been said by the two previous presentations, which is quite fitting for a concluding presentation. So, first, at the heart of today's ecological crisis seems to lay an ethical one. We have the power to dangerously threaten life as we know it, and we seem unable to effectively limit this power. We have defined ourselves as being outside and above nature, entitled but also able to control it and bend it to our will. Hans Jonas metaphorically described this using the Greek figure of Prometheus. Prometheus going against the god, stealing the sacred fire, and unleashing this limitless and infinite power. Prometheus finally unbound. But the very same thing that made us feel unstoppable is now threatening to break us down. The same technological power that made us raise is now making us realize just how vulnerable we actually are as we understand more and more the environmental threats that looms over our heads. Our aspirations and needs may know no boundaries, but the planet we live in is in every way limited. And here I'm coming back to this idea of limit and boundaries, and it is certain that it's far from being a new idea. It was there in a certain way in the debate that opposed Malthusians to cornucopian. And although international law never fully embraced a preservationist approach to nature's protection, it has not remained completely impervious to the idea of boundaries. Actually, many of these boundaries are currently regulated by international instruments, such as the climate change. But these regimes have not been effective, and there seems to be a gap between what science tells us about these boundaries and how the law goes about them. And I am referring here to the concept of planetary boundaries, and it has been explained quite well by the previous presentations, so I will not get too much into it. But I'm using the concept that has been put forward mainly by Rockstrom and its team, and what they said is that there is 9 Earth system processes that make planetary boundaries, and they have linked each of these boundaries to a threshold that, if crossed, may trigger nonlinear changes. And collectively, these boundaries are linked to each other, and they form what has been referred to as safe operating space for humanity. But none of these elements are currently taken into consideration by the law, at least at the international level. The nonlinearity of the changes, the interrelationship between the boundaries, and even the existence of unyielding threshold is not really there. And perhaps more surprisingly or not, this knowledge is glaringly absent from the way we define one of the most structural concepts of the last decades, sustainable development. Presented as this strategic and fundamental concept for shaping and even saving the future of the planet, sustainable development has since been both acclaimed and criticized. Either way, it has become this fundamental political and legal paradigm. And as a legal paradigm, it has been highly ineffective. Perhaps even it has been outdated from the moment it came. And mainly because of the way we defined it. And this will structure my presentation. I will first go behind some of the reasons of the failure of sustainable development as a legal paradigm before suggesting some ways of redefining it. Conceptually, sustainable development holds many flaws, but perhaps, and this has been said before, its most noticeable one is its lack of a clear consensual definition. At the same token, this is also the reason of its success, its attractiveness. Inspiring enough to unite all, but vague enough to bind no one. And what sustainable development means really depends on who's using the term. Thus, sustainability comes in many, many shades, all 50 of them. And among all the existing understanding and definition of sustainable development, I chose to focus on the one put forward by the Brundtland Report in 1987, although I acknowledge that it was not the first time that the concept has been used and that sustainability in itself is an even older concept. And the reason why I chose this definition, it's because it was really after the publication of the report that this concept fully penetrated international law and became this ubiquitous paradigm that we all know of. So how does the Brundtland Report define it? And the definition has been mentioned earlier, but I'm going to put it again. It has been defined as a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. A very lovely and well-known definition. But that's not all. Oh, and it has been a little bit, I will read it anyway. The report also builds on this idea that there is no inherent opposition between economic growth and environmental protection. They are interdependent. Even more, they are mutually reinforcing components of the same thing, of sustainable development. And the report does mention the idea of limits, but it's quite ambivalent about them because it put forward this idea that limits can be changed thanks to scientific and technological progress, making its conception of sustainability more in line with what we call the weak sustainability model. And the way we define sustainable development is crucial because this will determine how we'll make it legally operational. And the legal nature of sustainable development itself is still uncertain. There's many, many debates among scholars. It was always the case. We don't know if it's a principle, a mere concept. What we know is that it's an overarching objective, and as such, quite a clear one at that. As such, it needs to be made legally operational to have any kind of normative effect. Otherwise, it's just there. And this has been done in two ways. First, we have defined more specific sub-objectives, which are the SDGs. And second, we have linked it to legal principles. And we have identified many principles linked to sustainable development. The principle of precaution, the principle of equity. But among all these principles, the principle of integration is quite interesting as it embodies the ideology behind sustainable development. And the importance of this principle is perhaps best illustrated by the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development. Its fourth principle states that in order to achieve sustainable development, environmental protection shall constitute an integral part of the development process and cannot be considered in isolation from it. And the New Delhi Declaration of the Principles of International Law relating to Sustainable Development further defines this principle as reflecting the interdependence of social, economic, financial, environmental, and human rights aspects of principles and rules of international law relating to sustainable development. It also says that states should strive to resolve appearing conflicts between competing economic, financial, and social and environmental consideration. And at the legislative, judicial, and administrative level, this means that states need to take into consideration social and economic interest while protecting the environment, and vice versa. They need to balance the different dimensions. And in the previous, and I find it quite interesting, in the previous presentation, there have been said that we moved from this conception of sustainable development as these three circles, these three pillars. Well, not in the legal field. We are still stuck in this conception of it, and this is what's quite problematic from a legal perspective. And so legally, we still are in this representation of sustainable development as these three interlocking circles at the heart of which sustainability magically appears. And we have this idea that these pillars are of equal importance and thus needs to be balanced, and which allows for trades-off. And quite unsurprisingly, I would say, the trades-off have been made at the cost of the environment. Inherently, there is nothing wrong with the principle of integration. I mean, we cannot indeed consider these elements as being separated because they are not, they're linked. We have to take them into account altogether. However, as a principle, integration is highly ineffective, and it is ineffective for at least two reasons. First, as pointed out by many authors, this process, this approach, gives us no indication on the purpose of the integration or its direction. And this is because sustainable development is too unclear. We don't know where we're going. By just saying, oh, we have to integrate in order to achieve sustainable development, great, but what is it? Where are we going? And this means that when states are balancing between different interests and different dimensions, the result will differ tremendously depending on the trade-off they make and depending on what they deem an acceptable middle ground. Second, sustainable development has been built on a very flawed conception, and this conception is that all dimensions are of equal importance. The man-made system represented by the social and economic pillars and the nature system represented by the environmental pillar are not equal. Nature is the premise needed for the other two to exist. So how can we make sustainable development more effective and more in line with our current knowledge of the global risk we're facing? Well, first, if we agree that the environmental pillar is the foundation on which the other two stands, well, we need to protect it first. So there needs to be some hierarchy, and otherwise everything just falls apart. And first, we have to change the way we define sustainable development. This is the first step. And taking back the original definition, I have tweaked it a little bit to be more in line with this idea of hierarchy. And for example, and this is just a suggestion, we can define it as a development that meets the needs of the present within the limits of the planet, as to not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And here, nature and the respect of the limits is a premise for both current and future development. But this is not enough. We also need to change the way we regulate the sub-objectives that further define sustainable development. So currently, these objectives are enshrined in a General Assembly, United Nations General Assembly resolution. And the way they have been defined is we have defined these objectives and we have linked some mostly vague qualitative standards represented by targets that the states have to reach. But this is still not enough to guide the action of the states. So to make them more operational, there is a tool often used by environmental law methodology, and that author Joanne Duster have modified to make it fit better the international legal system, and it's called a flowchart. So we take the overarching objective of sustainable development, and then for each sub-objective, we need some element to make it legally operational. Currently, we do have the quality and quantitative standards to a certain degree, but we don't have the protective measures, we don't have effective emission limits, and we don't have enforcement rules. And unfortunately, due to time constraint, I won't be able to go into detail in each of these elements, and I will focus then on the emission limits, because this is where the concept of planetary boundaries can be most useful. So emission limits are what we refer to as fixed norm. They don't allow for any type of balancing, any type of trades-off. They used to be included within the climate change regime with the Kyoto Protocol, but they disappeared with the Paris Agreement, replaced by the voluntary contribution, because we moved from top-down approach to bottom-up approach. And nothing wrong with the bottom-up approach, but there is something wrong when the sum of all voluntary contribution does not allow us to remain within the threshold. And here perhaps I would like to take a few seconds to acknowledge, because this is not something I said, that I acknowledge that there are some issues with the way the concept of planetary boundaries have been defined, that there is uncertainty around the threshold, and that even the concept of safe operating space for humanity is quite controversial, because we can't speak of humanity as this unified thing. So there is a need to revise this concept and rediscuss it, and there has been some quite interesting work done there by social science. But this does not change the fact that there are limits and there are thresholds, whatever these might be, and they need to be reflected within the law. So how can we do it? Well, for example, if I take sustainable sub-objective number 7, which is related to energy sustainability, we need to have protective measures, we need to have enforcement measures, but we need to link it to the relevant threshold. And here, the relevant threshold is, for example, the one of limitation of green gas emission. And I'm not really touching on the question of the normative value of the SDGs, because they are currently considered as being part of the soft law, and this is a whole other topic. I'm mainly focusing on the way we define them. And so this would need to be done at the global level first, and then these thresholds would need to be further divided among states and within states. And when doing that, we can take into consideration past responsibilities, current mean, so forth and so on, to be more in line with social justice requirement or environmental justice requirements. As for a principle, I suggest to replace the principle of integration by a principle of prioritization to be more in line with this new definition of sustainable development. And if I take back the New Delhi Declaration and I use it as a template to help me define this principle, we could, for example, define it as a principle that reflects the dependence of the socioeconomic system upon the Earth system, as well as the need for current and future generation to remain within planetary boundaries. And states should strive to ensure that conflicts between competing economic, financial, social, and environmental consideration do not lead to trades-off that threaten the Earth's ability to support and maintain ecological processes and a diverse community of organisms. And I would like to conclude my presentation by saying that there are many, many questions that are left unanswered by my presentation, such as the normative value that we could give this principle, or its articulation with the principle of sovereignty, which is quite important in international law, or even how to effectively make the concept of planetary boundaries compatible with environmental justice requirements. The way we define and distribute responsibilities is also very important, because currently we are more in a state where we are considering that no one is legally responsible for the situation we are in, and this is unmanageable. which means that there is a need for more research and more interdisciplinary research, which makes symposiums such as this one very important. And I will finish and conclude by quoting a biologist and author, Edward Wilson, that says that the greatest enterprise of the mind has been and always will be to attempt linkage of the science and humanities, and the ongoing fragmentation of knowledge and resulting chaos in philosophy are not reflecting of the real world, but are artifacts of scholarship. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time, but I will take one question before we move to the end of our program. So please. Yes, Alexandra.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. Yes, I have a question for you. I will take off my mask. I have a question for you. It's your new definition of sustainable development is very interesting to take in, or not to take into account, but to enter the question of planet boundaries. But the question is, which legal status would you like to give to planet boundaries? Is it a principle? Is it a purpose, legal purpose? So this is my question.
And this is a very interesting question that I have not touched on, the normative value to recognize even the principle of prioritization. And this is a difficult question because the problem in international law is that the way it is done, there is no central authority that will adopt legislation. So states are only binded by the treaties that they sign. So, for example, even if we redefine it and put it in a treaty, well, it will only bind the states that accept it. And this is quite theoretical, but there is a very interesting theory in this field. It's called the default theory. And this theory says that the problem with international law currently is it's not fitting to the global risk, because the default law, which is the law that applies when there is no treaty or when the law is too weak or uncertain, is the principle of sovereignty. And this principle is not well thought or no longer well fitted to the current global threats. And we need to change what the default law is, basically what would apply when there is no treaty. This is quite ambitious, but I think that this idea of hierarchy should be the new default law, like the law that applies when there is no treaty. This would be very, very difficult because I don't think states are anywhere near abandoning their conception of sovereignty. But this is certainly something that needs to be further discussed and worked on. But yeah.
Thank you so much. So it's 6:45, so I would like to thank our speakers, Alexandra Langlais, Eric Pino, and Farah Jerrari. Thank you very much for the stimulating debates. And I will call Gwenaëlle Imfeld for the Best PhD Award ceremony. So Gwenaëlle, please, I give you the floor.
Yes, ladies, gentlemen, thank you very much. So now it's a fun moment of the day because this is now time to award the 2021 RISE Thesis Prize. So the 2021 RISE Thesis Award in Environmental and Sustainability Sciences awards a PhD thesis that combines, to varying degrees and in various ways, biogeophysical sciences to understand the functioning of ecosystems and human and social sciences to understand human relations, perceptions, and or associated policies and their evolution. The thesis must have been defended during last year or this year and must have been delivered by an institution of the Alsatian academic sites member of RISE. And the winner of the 2021 RISE Award is Raúl Polit Casillas. And this is for the thesis entitled Evolutive Systems, Architecture, Designs, Design Optimization and Implementation of Adaptable, Regenerative and Reactive Complex System Architectures in the Era of Climatic Scarcity. I think Raoul is with us on Zoom. This thesis has been advised by Emmanuel Caillot, University of Strasbourg at ECUBE, the Engineering Science, Computer Science and Imaging Laboratory. This PhD thesis is of fundamental and theoretical nature. It integrates a holistic and multidisciplinary view to develop an innovative and synergenic approach to the engineering design of complex architectural systems. These works aim to address the issue of balancing the levels of complexity and demands of engineering systems with the decreasing availability of resources, doing more and better with less, corresponding to the societal issues it clearly addresses. So this thesis addresses a relevant topic in system and design engineering, namely how to design evolving complex systems which adapt to new design stressors, socio-economic contexts, and new system characteristics. It developed an evolutionary architecture's design methods and also questioned current architectural paradigms and working on life cycles of material design and construction. So the RISE committee particularly appreciated the strong expression of this PhD thesis to integrate the notion of resilience and adaptation to global change into a holistic design of architectural systems, as well as a genuine critiques of current architectural norms and paradigms. So on behalf of RISE, congratulations, Raoul, and I will be very happy to give you the prize whenever you come to Strasbourg. Mr. Casillas could not join us today because he had to stay in Spain. Now, please, Raoul, thank you and congratulations.
Au nouveau défi, c'est un honneur pour moi de recevoir ce prix. En effet, nous quittons le thème historique et la façon de nous concevons, construction et exploitons notre monde est crucial. Je vais m'intéresser passer à l'anglais parce qu'il est plus familier. Encore une fois, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. It's truly an honor.
Thank you, Raoul. And now you're all invited to the art performance by Laurent Rennes, who joined the FERED from the very beginning and designed this performance, especially for this symposium. Thank you very much, Laurent. It's an honor and a pleasure to follow you now.
So we are going in the main entrance, and I'll have a speech right there.